She had nothing left. No coat. No name. No reason to stand back up. Savannah Hale sat inside a cracked bus shelter at the edge of nowhere, wearing a dress meant for a dinner that ended in humiliation, while the coldest storm of the winter tried to finish what her husband started. Her fingers had stopped hurting 20 minutes ago. That was the part that scared her. When pain stops, something worse begins. Then the ground started shaking. Not the wind, not thunder, something deeper, something coming from the dark end of the road like judgment wearing leather and riding iron. She didn't know whether to run or pray. She couldn't do either. Hey, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, stay with me until the end of this one. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I want to know where you are. Now let's go back to that bus shelter, because what happened next changed everything. The bus shelter smelled like old cigarette smoke and rust, the kind of smell that accumulates over years of people passing through without stopping, waiting for something that may or may not come. Savannah Hale had been sitting on the cold metal bench for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She knew because she'd watched her phone battery count down from 19% to 4, and each percentage felt like a small surrender. Outside, the storm had evolved from inconvenience to threat. The snow came sideways now, driven by a wind that found every gap in the shelter's cracked plexiglass walls, every tear in her dress, every place where warmth had once existed in her body. She was 30 years old, and she had nothing. Not in the dramatic way people say it when they're frustrated with traffic or a bad day at work. Nothing in the literal inventory of a person stripped to the frame. The dress she wore was dark green satin, something she'd bought for their 5th anniversary dinner 2 years ago, and never found occasion to wear until tonight, when Daniel had called from the restaurant, already there, already seated, already holding the news he'd been rehearsing for weeks, and told her to dress up because they needed to talk like adults. She should have heard it in those words. Like adults. As if she'd been something less. The restaurant had been warm, candlelight, a bottle of wine that cost more than her weekly grocery budget, which he'd ordered without asking. Daniel Hale across the table from her, 42 years old, silver at his temples in the way men got silver and called it distinguished, his hands flat on the white tablecloth, his voice already prepared. The tests were conclusive, he'd said, both rounds. She'd known about the tests. She'd been the one sitting in the doctor's office for both of them, the one who'd asked the questions and held the pamphlets and let the specialist explain in careful language what irreversible meant. She'd known for 6 weeks. She'd been trying to find the right moment to tell him, the right words, the right way to say that the thing he'd wanted, the thing they'd planned, was simply not a biological possibility. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. He hadn't let her find the moment. He'd scheduled his own. "I can't do this," he'd said. Quiet, measured, rehearsed. "This isn't the life I signed up for." The wine sat between them untouched, and she remembered thinking that was wrong, that the wine should have been drunk, that you should drink something before you dismantle a person. She'd asked him what he meant by signed up for, as if marriage were an enlistment form, as if she were a contract he'd discovered contained errors in the fine print. "You're broken," he'd said. And the quiet in which he said it was worse than shouting would have been. "I mean that medically, functionally. I'm not being cruel, Savannah. I'm being honest. There's a difference." She'd left. She hadn't cried, which surprised her. She'd simply stood, pushed the chair back, and walked out into the night in her green dress and the thin cardigan she'd thought would be enough between the car and the restaurant door. Except Daniel had driven, and Daniel had not followed her out. The rideshare app had showed a 40-minute wait. She'd started walking. 40 minutes became 2.5 hours, became the bus shelter at the edge of Millhaven's Eastern District, the last shelter before the highway, beside a gas station whose neon sign buzzed and flickered in the wind. Open. 24 hours, 1 letter dark, the sign reading Pen 24 hours now, which felt like something. She wasn't sure what. Her phone died at 3%. She hadn't called anyone in the remaining battery because she'd gone through her contacts the way you go through a house after a flood, taking inventory of what's actually yours and what was always just borrowed. Her mother was in Phoenix and would answer with the particular energy of someone who'd expected this. Her college friends had migrated into the lives of wives and mothers that Savannah had been supposed to follow into, and calling them tonight, in this dress, in this storm, felt like showing up to a party you'd been quietly uninvited from. Her work colleagues were colleagues. There was no one. She pulled her cardigan tighter across her chest and watched the snow accumulate on the road in front of her. The cold had moved past discomfort 40 minutes ago. Now it was doing something more structural. Her feet were no longer precise instruments. Her thoughts kept sliding, losing their grip on the next sentence, drifting towards something low and gray and very quiet. She recognized the drift the way you recognize a current in water. Not with alarm, because alarm requires energy, but with the passive awareness that something is taking you somewhere you didn't decide to go. She thought about Daniel's voice saying, broken. She let herself sit with that word the way you sit with a stone in your shoe, waiting to see if it will stop being sharp. It didn't stop. It just became the ambient condition of everything. The road out of Millhaven toward the highway was long and straight, and in summer it was the kind of road that seemed to go somewhere meaningful, cutting through fields and tree lines with purpose. In winter it was a black corridor with white edges and very little reason to exist. At 11:17 on a Wednesday night in February, there was no traffic. There was no sound except wind and the stuttering neon and Savannah's own breathing, which had become something she was having to manage manually, like a machine with a failing automatic function. She didn't hear them at first. It came up through the bench, actually. Vibration before sound, the way bass notes arrive in the body before the ears catch up. She felt it in her tailbone, in her sternum. A frequency that bypassed thought and went directly to something older, something animal, the part of the nervous system that predates language and logic and asks only, should I run? Then she heard it. Not one engine, not two. The sound was plural and layered, a low industrial chord that grew from the east end of the road and built as it came, growing from suggestion to presence, to something that made the shelter's cracked panels vibrate in their frames. Headlights appeared at the bend. One pair, then another, then a third, a fourth, spacing out across the road in formation, amber and white cutting through the snow. The sound reached her chest cavity now, each engine distinct but woven together into something that was less a collection of motorcycles and more a single organism with multiple hearts. Savannah stood up. She wasn't sure why. Some reflex of being seen, perhaps. The instinct to be vertical when something that powerful arrives, as if sitting meant surrender. She stood at the edge of the shelter with her arms wrapped across her chest, her green dress plastered against her legs by the wind, the snow already stinging the parts of her face she'd stopped feeling an hour ago. The first rider passed without slowing, then the second. The formation held its speed, disciplined, practiced, the kind of riding that said these men had done this 10,000 miles together and knew each other's weight and rhythm and reaction time. The bikes were large American machines, their chrome catching the fractured neon, leather saddlebags and rolled bedrolls behind the seats, club patches visible on the backs of jackets, even in the dark. A hawk with spread wings stitched in gold thread on black leather, letters she couldn't read at that distance. She watched them pass and felt something sink in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. She had not expected to be saved. She had not even consciously framed it as saving. But watching the lights go past, watching the formation hold and vanish into the snow ahead, she felt the precise weight of not being stopped for, which is a different and more specific loneliness than ordinary invisibility. Then the rearmost light slowed. A single bike broke from the tail of the formation, braking with the careful control of someone managing ice and reduced visibility, coming to a stop 20 yards past the shelter before reversing carefully, the engine dropping to a low idle. The rider sat on the bike for a moment without dismounting, watching her the way you watch something you need to be sure of before you commit to a response. Then the kickstand went down. The engine cut. And the rider swung off the bike with the practiced ease of someone for whom dismounting was as automatic as breathing. He was large, not in a decorative way, in the way of someone who had been built by actual physical labor and actual combat and years of carrying weight that wasn't always metaphorical. 6'2", maybe 6'3", the heavy jacket making his shoulders architectural, the snow catching in hair that was dark and cut short against a face that in the stuttering neon light showed itself as angular, weathered, a jaw that carried the kind of set that comes from years of containing things that wanted out. A scar ran from his left temple down toward his jaw, faded silver-white against his skin. The kind of scar that had a story and had also long since stopped being the most important thing about its owner. His eyes were gray. She registered them when he was still 10 feet away. Gray like overcast sky, like smoke above a fire that's been burning a long time and is more exhausted than dramatic. They found her face and stayed there with a directness that was not aggressive, but also offered no softness to hide behind. This was a man who had learned somewhere that the most honest thing you can give another person is your full and undivided attention. "You waiting for a bus?" he asked. His voice was low and flat, the kind of voice that had learned economy. No excess. "It stopped running," she said. 2 hours ago." He looked at her dress, her cardigan, her bare arms. He looked at the shelter, the dead neon of her phone visible through the thin fabric of the cardigan pocket, the accumulated snow on her shoulders she hadn't noticed. His jaw tightened slightly. Not anger, something more contained. The look of a man who has seen what happens to people when no one stops. "You got somewhere to be?" The question landed in her chest like a physical thing. Somewhere to be. The apartment was Daniel's. Had always been Daniel's, technically, his name on the lease. The arrangement that had made sense when they were building towards something together and made no sense now that the building was done and she wasn't included in the structure. She had a key that she suspected he'd already asked the super to invalidate. She had a grocery bag of clothes in the closet that she'd been meaning to move to the spare room because they didn't fit the way they used to. She had her name on a joint bank account that she had not touched in 4 months because Daniel managed the finances and it had never seemed worth the friction. "No," she said. He looked at her for 3 seconds. She counted. Then he pulled his jacket off, a motion that was completely unhurried, as if he had all the time in a storm for this, and held it out to her. "Put this on." You're hypothermic," he said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "Your lips are blue. Put it on." The jacket weighed more than she expected. The leather was thick and worn and smelled like motor oil and something underneath that. Wood smoke, cold air, the residue of long miles. She pushed her arms through the sleeves and the warmth hit her in a wave that was almost painful after the long cold, her nerve endings waking back up and registering the damage with offended precision. He pulled out a phone and called a number. Waited. "I'm at the highway shelter on Route 9, he said when it answered. "I need you to turn around." A pause. "I'm not asking." He ended the call. He looked back at her. "What's your name?" "Savannah." "Ryder Knox." He said it without offering a hand, which she would have been too numb to shake anyway. Just an exchange of names, a establishing of terms. The formation, which had continued east, began to reappear from the distance. A cluster of headlights turning back, reforming, coming toward them at a measured pace. The sound returned to the shelter like weather, like the kind of thing that changes the barometric pressure of a place. Savannah watched them come and tried to calibrate what was happening to any framework she possessed for understanding the world. It didn't fit any framework she possessed. A convoy of outlaw bikers in a winter storm, turning around on a highway, coming back for a woman in a green dress who had not asked and had no reason to expect. The first riders reached them and pulled to the shoulder, engines dropping to idle, boots finding ground. They were uniformly large, uniformly leather-clad, their faces weathered and various. A black man with a shaved head and a jaw like a concrete block, a compact red-haired man with a scar through his eyebrow, an older rider with silver temples and the kind of stillness that reads as leadership even in rest. They looked at Savannah with expressions ranging from neutral to something that might have been concern, and not one of them spoke first. "She needs to come with us," Ryder said to the group. Not requesting, informing. The silver-templed man, 60 maybe, with a face that had been through something extensive, looked at Savannah for a moment. "Can you get on a bike?" "I've never—" "Diesel will take her on the sidecar," someone said from the back. "He's got the rig." A larger bike was walked forward. Not a standard configuration, but a custom setup with a low-slung side compartment, heavily padded, enclosed enough to cut wind. The man walking it was enormous, mid-40s, with a beard that had gone gray at the edges and hands that were the size of small shovels. And when he looked at Savannah, his expression contained something she had not seen directed at herself in recent memory. Simple, uncomplicated concern. No agenda behind it, no assessment. "It's warm," he said, meaning the sidecar. "I got the heat running." She climbed in. Her legs barely worked. Diesel tucked a heavy wool blanket around her with a practiced efficiency that suggested this was not the first time he had folded a frozen or traumatized person into that sidecar, and then he returned to his bike without ceremony. The formation reformed around her. Not in front, not behind, around. She was in the middle of it, cocooned in leather and wool and the low vibrating warmth of a dozen engines, and the convoy moved back onto the road heading east, and Savannah Hale, who had been sitting alone in the cold trying not to disappear, found herself carried. She didn't cry. Later, she would wonder at that, but in the moment, she was simply too cold and too stunned and too emptied out to cry, and what she felt instead was something stranger and more complicated, a profound disorientation at being inside the category of people that others stop for. The Iron Covenant MC's clubhouse was not what she'd been told to expect from the word clubhouse. She'd had half an image assembled from films and television, dark rooms, pool tables scarred from brawls, women she wasn't supposed to look at directly, the implicit menace of a place where rules existed but were not posted anywhere visible. What she found instead was a converted roadside garage on a 2-acre lot at the edge of Mill Haven's western outskirts, half a mile from the county line, set back from the road by a long gravel drive that the snow had turned to white carpet. The main building was old and wide and built from the kind of materials that had been here when everything else was field. Heavy timber framing, corrugated metal siding that had been painted dark red at some point and had weathered to something warmer and more complicated than red. Windows with light bleeding from the edges of heavy curtains. There was a covered porch running the length of the building. There were planters on the porch railing, empty now in winter, but with the skeletal remains of last summer's plants still standing in them with a kind of dignity. There was a child's bicycle leaning against the wall near the door, its handlebars dusted with snow. The formation pulled into the gravel lot and engines cut one by one, the sound descending in layers until the night held only wind and the settling ticks of hot metal cooling. The riders dismounted and moved toward the main building with the easy choreography of people who have made this particular approach 10,000 times. And Diesel unfolded the blanket from around Savannah and helped her out of the sidecar with the same matter-of-fact competence with which he'd installed her. Her legs were uncertain. He steadied her without comment and without letting go until she nodded. Inside, the main room hit her with warmth so sudden and complete that her eyes watered. Not from emotion, but from the simple physiological shock of heat against frozen skin. The room was large and low-ceilinged with exposed timber beams overhead and a wood stove against the far wall that was doing serious work, its iron sides radiating visible waves. There were heavy tables, mismatched chairs, a long bar against one wall with stools, and a coffee maker that someone had left running, the smell reaching her before she'd consciously registered it, that particular smell of coffee and wood smoke that belonged to places where people actually lived rather than performed living. The walls were covered, not with the things she'd half expected, not trophies or weapons or anything performatively dangerous, but with photographs, hundreds of them, pinned and framed in no particular order, covering the timber and plaster in an irregular, dense mosaic. Group photos at rallies, smaller portraits, what appeared to be charity events. Men in leather vests next to children in hospital beds, next to veterans in wheelchairs, next to burned-out buildings being rebuilt. Maps with routes marked. A flag mounted above the bar. Not a club flag, but an American flag. The kind that had been folded into a triangle at some point and then unfolded for display. The fold line still visible. Ryder was already inside. He'd come in ahead of her somehow, through another entrance, and was standing at the bar in a thermal undershirt now that she'd commandeered his jacket, pouring coffee into a mug with the unhurried certainty of a man who does this many times daily and finds no theater in it. He set the mug on the bar in front of an empty stool. "Sit," he said. She sat. The stool was solid and warm from use, and she wrapped both hands around the mug and let the heat work its way into her palms. The other riders filtered in around her, some moving to the far end of the bar, some to the tables, one going directly to the wood stove to add a split log with the proprietorial ease of a man who tends this particular fire. They spoke to each other in short exchanges, in a register that was private without being secretive, the conversational shorthand of people who know each other well enough that most communication is subtext and inference. None of them stared at her. She noticed this specifically because she'd expected the opposite. The performed awareness of a woman in an unfamiliar male space, the weight of being looked at and evaluated. What she got instead was a kind of considered courtesy, a collective decision to not make her the center of any room she hadn't volunteered to be the center of. It was more sophisticated than she'd been prepared for. "Drink that," Ryder said, nodding at the coffee. He was leaning with his back against the counter now, watching her the way he'd watched her from the bike, directly, without softness to hide behind, but also without the quality she associated with men who watched women: assessment, possession, calculation. He was watching the way a medic watches a patient, looking for the thing that needed addressing first. She drank. The coffee was strong and black and slightly overbrewed, the kind of coffee that had been keeping people upright for hours, and wasn't apologizing for it. "You need to eat something," he said. "Reheating meat on the stove, 20 minutes. "You don't have to, I know I don't." She was quiet. The red-haired man with the scarred eyebrow had settled at the table nearest her and was working on something mechanical, a carburetor or some equivalent, spread on a cloth on the table, his hands moving with the assurance of long familiarity. He glanced up at her without apparent agenda. "Ghost," he said, by way of introduction, tapping his own chest. "Real name's Podrick, but nobody's called me that since the 4th grade. "Savannah, I know." A pause. He turned a small bolt between his fingers. Ryder called ahead. She looked at Ryder. He'd turned toward the stove and was doing something with a cast-iron pan, moving with the same economical competence he seemed to bring to everything, and didn't look back. "There are rooms in the back," Ryder said without turning. "Clean. Heat works. Nobody's going to bother you. I don't want to impose." He turned then, just to look at her once. Something passed across the gray eyes that was not quite amusement and not quite exasperation, something more patient than either. "Storm's not going to let up until morning," he said. "You can figure the rest out then. Tonight, sleep." What she wanted to say was that she didn't have the language for this, didn't have a category in which to file it. That kindness from strangers she had always been able to process as simple charity, a transaction with clear terms. But that what she was receiving here was something with no obvious transaction structure and therefore no obvious way to discharge the debt of it. What she said was nothing, because the coffee was doing its work and the warmth was doing its work, and something in her that had been wound very tight for a very long time was, against her will and entirely against her plans for the evening, beginning to loosen. The man by the wood stove straightened and turned, and she got her first clear look at him. The silver-templed man from outside, who she'd placed as the group's second authority. He was older than she'd thought, closer to 65, with the particular kind of fitness that comes not from vanity, but from a life that has always required the body to cooperate. His face was lined with deep creases at the eyes that could have been from smiling or squinting into wind at high speed, and probably both. He crossed to the bar and poured his own coffee and leaned against the counter to her left. "Breed," he said. "Just the name, like the others." "Is that everyone has one name?" "Road name," he said. "Earned, not given. Most of us stopped using anything else years ago." He said it without performance, simply stating the terms of a world she'd stumbled into. Ryder kept his legal name. He's the only one. She looked down the bar to where Ryder was moving the cast iron with one hand. Why? Breed considered the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Said it would be dishonest," he said finally, "to put on a different name, like he was hiding from something. Ryder Knox is who he is. Take it or leave it." She absorbed this. Thought of Daniel across the candlelit table with his rehearsed sentences and his careful language and the enormous gap between what he'd said and what it was. Take it or leave it was, she thought, a different operating principle entirely. She was most of the way through the coffee when the door at the back of the main room opened and 3 small people came through it in various states of nighttime disarray. The first was a girl, maybe 9, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with the expression of someone who has mastered the performance of being unimpressed as a survival mechanism. She wore pajamas with cartoon wolves on them and held a stuffed animal that had been repaired multiple times with visible stitching in a different color than the original material. She looked at Savannah with the direct assessing gaze of a child who has learned not to look away from new things. Behind her, a boy of about 6 with hair that went in several directions at once, and the particular determined sleepiness of a child who has woken up for a reason and is managing the inconvenience of still being tired. And behind him, another girl, younger, 4 or 5, who entered with her eyes already on Ryder's back with an expression of profound relief at locating him in the room. "Dad," the youngest said. Ryder turned from the stove immediately, the pan set aside and dropped to one knee as the youngest crossed the room at speed. He caught her and stood in a single motion, holding her against his chest, and she buried her face in his neck with the boneless trust of a child who is completely certain of the place she occupies in the world. "Heard the bikes," the oldest girl said, by way of explanation for their presence. She was looking at Savannah with continued directness. "Who are you?" "Emma," Ryder said, not a reprimand. "A note." "It's a reasonable question," Emma said, and this was so clearly true that Ryder simply looked at her for a moment and said nothing. "Savannah," Savannah said, "I was cold. Your father—" She stopped, because the word father in this context required revision. These children did not look like him, did not match each other in the way of biological siblings. What they matched was the particular coherence of people who have attached to each other through decision rather than biology. "He stopped," she finished. Emma considered this. "He always does," she said. "It came out neither proud nor simple, just factual, the way you state something that has been consistently true your entire life and has therefore earned the status of natural law." The boy had climbed onto a bar stool 2 seats from Savannah and was watching her with open curiosity and no social anxiety whatsoever. "I'm Marcus," he said. "I'm 6. Are you going to stay?" "Marcus," Ryder said. "It's also a reasonable question," Marcus said. Ryder looked at the ceiling for a moment with an expression that suggested this was a recurring experience. Savannah looked at the boy, at the simple directness of the question, at the complete absence of agenda behind it. "Are you going to stay?" Ask the way you ask about weather, not hopefully or fearfully, just wanting to know the actual information so it can be incorporated into the model of how things are. "I don't know," she said. Marcus nodded, accepting this as a legitimate answer. "Okay," he said. "Do you want to see my rock collection?" "Marcus, it's midnight," Ryder said. "I know where they are in the dark." Ryder closed his eyes briefly, opened them. The youngest, still in his arms, had turned her head enough to look at Savannah with wide, dark eyes over his shoulder, and what she communicated in that look was both simpler and more devastating than anything the others had said. Simple curiosity. The complete, unconscious openness of a child who has been safe enough, long enough, to look at new people without fear. She offered Savannah a small wave. Savannah's throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with cold. The room they gave her was small and clean, with a window that looked out on the snow-covered lot where the bikes stood in their formation, still and dark now, their chrome just barely catching the light from the porch. There was a heavy quilt on the narrow bed and a lamp with a warm bulb on the nightstand and a hook on the back of the door where someone had hung a towel without being asked. She sat on the edge of the bed in Ryder's jacket, which she had not given back, and let the events of the last 6 hours arrange themselves into some kind of sequence she could hold. The restaurant. Daniel's hands flat on the white cloth. The word broken in his measured, reasonable, rehearsed voice. The cold of the shelter and the counting down of battery percentage and the vibration of engines coming up through the bench before sound. The jacket dropped over her shoulders. The child's wave from Ryder's arms. "You're broken," Daniel had said. "I mean that medically. Functionally." She looked down at her hands, bare now, the silver band gone. She'd taken it off in the restaurant before she'd left, some instinct she couldn't explain, and set it beside the untouched wine glass. Her hands were not the hands of someone medically, functionally broken. They were cold and slightly chapped from the storm, and they were shaking faintly, not from cold now, but from the particular trembling of a body that has absorbed too much in too short a time and is processing it at the cellular level. Somewhere in the main room, she could hear the low murmur of voices, the clink of something being set down, the particular subsonic frequency of men at rest after long riding. No laughter, no aggression, just the ambient sound of people sharing space in an uncomplicated way. She lay back on the bed without meaning to, and the quilt received her, and the pillow received her, and the warmth of the room received her, and she tried to stay awake to think through what she would do in the morning, the specific logical sequence of steps she would need to take to reassemble something from what remained of her life. But the cold had taken more out of her than she'd accounted for, and the warmth was doing the opposite. She was asleep before she'd decided whether to let herself be. The morning revealed the clubhouse differently. What darkness and storm had made dramatic and imposing, dawn with its gray winter light made simply functional. A working space that had been shaped by the practical requirements of many people living and maintaining things in close proximity. The main room looked larger in daylight, the photographs clearer, the accumulated detail of a decade of habitation visible in the particular distribution of use-worn surfaces and the location of hooks and shelves and the way the furniture had settled into configurations that had proven correct over time. Savannah found the kitchen through a door behind the bar, a real kitchen, large enough with industrial appliances and heavy shelving loaded with institutional quantities of dry goods, a long table with benches. Two of the bikers she didn't have names for yet were already there. One reading something on a phone with professional focus. One standing at the stove with the particular competence of a man who has cooked for large numbers of people under various conditions. The man at the stove turned when he heard her and nodded. Late 30s, brown skin, an eye that didn't track quite right. Nerve damage, she thought, or shrapnel, something that had been handled with the best medicine available and had left a remainder. He had hands like a surgeon's except for the scarring on the backs of them. And he moved around the kitchen with the absolute spatial ownership of someone who has decided this is his domain and arranged it accordingly. "Biscuits," he said by way of morning greeting. "Coffee's fresh, eggs if you want them." "I don't want to." He looked at her sideways, the non-tracking eye giving it an odd quality. "If you say impose one more time," he said, "I'm going to make you wash every dish in this place personally." She almost smiled. "Okay." "Torch," he said. His road name, she understood now. "I did 2 tours as a combat medic, ran a field kitchen in Kandahar for 8 months when our cook took around, and I currently manage the nutritional requirements of 14 grown men and 3 children. You are not an imposition." He turned back to the stove. "You're a person who needs breakfast. Sit down." She sat. The coffee was different from last night's. Better, actually, with the precision of someone who treats it as a serious endeavor. The biscuits were homemade and still hot, and she ate 2 before she'd consciously decided to eat one, and the warmth of actual food after a night of nothing but coffee and shock settled into her in a way that felt almost aggressive, the body reasserting its requirements with emphasis. Ryder came through the kitchen at 7:15 in work clothes, heavy canvas pants, a thermal shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, boots already on, hair damp from a shower. He moved through the space with the same economical certainty, poured coffee, looked at her in a way that registered her presence and current state without making it a production. "Sleep?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded, accepting this data. "I called Doc Harmon. He'll come by this morning. Check for frostbite, hypothermia, after effects. You don't have to have money to need a doctor checked out," he said. Same tone as last night. Patient, precise, not unkind. "He's coming either way. You can refuse when he gets here. That's your business." She looked at him over the edge of her coffee mug. "You always like this?" A pause. Something shifted in the gray eyes. Not quite humor, something in that vicinity. "Like what?" "Like you've already made the decision and the conversation is just you informing me of it?" A longer pause. He drank his coffee. "Pretty much," he said. She should have found this irritating. She noted that she didn't. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway in the same determined manner he seemed to bring to all entrances, his hair no more organized than it had been at midnight, wearing a sweater with a dinosaur on it. He looked at Savannah as if confirming she was still present, then at Ryder. "Is she staying?" he asked. "That's Savannah's choice," Ryder said. "Yeah, but is she staying?" "Marcus." "I'm just asking." Ryder looked at Savannah without expression, waiting, it appeared, for her answer to a question she hadn't been asked directly, which was the only honest version of the question anyway. Not a logistics question, but the real one, which was something more like, "Has enough of the world failed you that you'll accept the version of the world that's being offered here?" She looked at the kitchen, the warmth of it, torch at the stove, the biscuits, the photographs she could see through the door, the accumulated evidence of lives chosen and built from what remained after the official structures had failed or collapsed or simply not included them. She thought of Daniel's flat hands on the white tablecloth. She thought of the word broken delivered with the clinical detachment of a man returning a defective product. She thought of Emma looking at her last night with that sharp, unimpressed, completely unafraid assessment, of the small wave from Ryder's arms, of the jacket that still carried the smell of miles. She didn't say anything out loud, but she didn't say no either. And Marcus, who was 6 and therefore did not need words to be spoken to understand answers, looked at Ryder with satisfaction and said, "I'm going to show her the rocks before school." Ryder looked at him for a long moment, looked at Savannah. The gray eyes held something she didn't yet have the vocabulary to name. Guarded, yes, and weathered down by time and grief to something very careful, but underneath that carefulness, something else, something that had not entirely made up its mind to stay gone. "After breakfast," he said, and went back to his coffee. Outside, the storm had moved on. The snow was still everywhere, the lot, the road, the long fields to the west. But the sky had cleared overnight to a brutal, clean winter blue, the kind that makes everything look sharp and slightly unreal, every edge defined, every shadow precise. The bikes stood in the lot under their coating of white, and the porch flag moved in a light wind that wasn't cold anymore, just present. Savannah put her hands around her coffee mug and looked at the window and let the silence of the kitchen be what it was. Somewhere in the building, she heard Emma's voice. Not the words, just the tone of it, the particular register of a child navigating morning with opinions. And Ryder's voice, lower, steadier. The two of them in some domestic negotiation whose specifics didn't matter because what mattered was the pattern. An argument that was also an affirmation, a complaint that was also an attachment. Two people who knew each other well enough that friction was its own form of closeness. She had not had that. Had not had it in the restaurant, in the lease in his name apartment. In the 5 years of a marriage she now understood had always been structured around a version of her that performed adequately but was never actually known. She was 30 years old and she had woken up in a stranger's house after the worst night of her life, and she did not feel safe exactly. That wasn't the word yet. Safety was a thing you built, and she knew that, and she was not naive enough to think one night changed the structural condition of her life. But she felt something adjacent to safe, something that in the specific context of where she had been 12 hours ago felt enormous. She felt simply like she had stopped falling, which was enough, for now. Which was more than she'd thought she'd get. And then the front door of the clubhouse opened, and the sound that came through it was not wind. It was a voice she knew, contained, measured, with that particular quality of a man who has always believed that volume is for people who haven't learned to be frightening in the register below it. Daniel Hale's voice, from the porch, asking to speak to his wife. Savannah's coffee mug stopped halfway to her mouth. In the kitchen doorway, Torch had turned from the stove without a word, a spatula in one hand, his expression completely neutral in the way of someone who has not yet made a decision about a situation and is gathering data. And in the hallway beyond him, she could hear the particular cadence of Ryder Knox's boots on the wooden floor. Not hurried, not loud, just steady. Moving toward the front. She didn't know what happened when a man like Daniel met a man like Ryder. She didn't know whether this was the moment everything unraveled or the moment something else began. All she knew was that she was in a warm kitchen with coffee getting cold in her hands, and the sound of the man who had called her broken was 12 feet away behind a door. And whether she went to that door or not would say something permanent about who she was on the other side of the worst night of her life. She set down the mug. She stood up. The boots stopped on the other side of the door. Savannah heard them. The particular weight of Daniel's Oxford shoes on the porch boards. The careful, measured pace of a man who had always believed that how you entered a room said something about whether you belonged in it. He knocked twice. Not loudly. He'd never needed volume. Daniel Hale had spent 15 years in corporate litigation, learning that the most effective pressure was applied quietly, with precision, in places you didn't see coming. She was already standing in the kitchen doorway when Ryder reached the front door. He didn't open it immediately. He stood with one hand flat against the doorframe, his weight balanced, listening to something in the quality of the knock the way a man trained to assess threat listens to footsteps in the dark. Then he opened it, Daniel stood on the porch in his good coat, charcoal wool, tailored, the one he wore when he needed to be taken seriously at a distance. Snow on his shoulders from the walk from wherever he'd parked. His face was composed in the particular way of a man who has prepared for a negotiation, neutral, controlled, projecting reasonable concern over a substrate of absolute certainty that he would get what he came for. He looked at Ryder and absorbed him in the way Daniel always absorbed obstacles. Not with alarm, but with the rapid recalibration of someone calculating leverage. "I'm looking for my wife," he said. "Savannah Hale. I have reason to believe she's here." Ryder said nothing for 3 seconds. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, arms loose at his sides, and looked at Daniel with the gray eyes that gave nothing and took everything in. The silence was not hostile. It was simply complete, and in its completeness it required Daniel to keep talking or feel what it felt like to have his words land on nothing. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Daniel said, adjusting. "She had a difficult night. I'm concerned. If you could just let me—" "She's here," Ryder said. Daniel's mouth came close to showing something. He managed it. "Then I'd like to speak with her." "I expect you would." Another silence. Daniel heard in it whatever Daniel heard, and turned his gaze past Ryder's shoulder and found Savannah standing in the kitchen doorway with cold coffee in her hands and a quilt crease still marking her left cheek. "Savannah," he said it gently, which was its own kind of pressure. "I've been worried sick. Come home so we can talk." The phrase "come home" registered in her body before it registered in her mind. A flinching, a reflexive gathering of the self inward. She watched it happen from the inside, recognized the mechanism. 12 years of a particular voice using a particular tone to mean a particular thing, and the body responding before the brain could apply context. She made herself breathe. "There's nothing to talk about," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved credit for. "Savannah." His voice dropped half a register, patient, long-suffering, the tone he used when she was being difficult. "You slept in a stranger's house. Let me take you home. We can work through this like adults." There it was again, like adults. The framing that made her the child, the irrational one, the one whose responses to events were disproportionate because she had failed to maintain the correct emotional temperature. She had heard this framing for 5 years and had believed it for most of them. "She said there's nothing to talk about," Ryder said. He hadn't moved. His voice was flat and even. Not aggressive, simply removing the negotiating space between what Savannah had said and what Daniel was trying to unsay. Daniel looked at him with the specific patience of a man containing genuine anger. "I don't know who you are, Ryder Knox, but this is between me and my wife." "She's standing right there," Ryder said. "If she wants to talk to you, that's her business. If she doesn't, you're on my porch and you're leaving." The calculus shifted in Daniel's face, not dramatically. He was too disciplined for that. But something realigned behind the eyes, the rapid revision of a man who had come expecting a type and had found something that didn't fit the type. He'd expected, Savannah understood, a crude obstacle, something loud and performatively dangerous that he could dismiss or, if necessary, involve authorities in dismissing. What he'd found was something more difficult. A man who was neither performing threat nor backing away from it. A man who appeared, genuinely, to have no interest in this interaction beyond the outcome Savannah had already stated. "Savannah," Daniel said again, looking past Ryder at her, directly at her now. Precise, targeted. "The things I said last night were accurate," she said. He paused. "Harsh. Not—" "You said I was broken," she said. "Medically, functionally. You said it wasn't cruel because it was honest. You rehearsed it. I could tell." She made herself hold his gaze. "I've been going over it, and the most honest part is that you've believed it for longer than last night. Last night was just the first time you said it out loud." The porch was quiet. The winter light made everything specific. Daniel's breath in the cold air, the snow on the porch railing, the particular stillness of a moment where a thing has been said that cannot be unsaid. "You're upset," he said. Falling back, she noticed, to the framing, because it was all he had. "You're not thinking clearly. Come home, sleep in your own bed, and we'll—" "Leave," Ryder said. Not loud, not aggressive, just final. Daniel looked at him one more time. Looked at the size of him, the quality of him, the absolute absence of anything that could be leveraged or bargained with. Then he looked back at Savannah, And what he allowed himself in that last look was something she had not seen from him before. A genuine flash of something that might have been the real feeling beneath all the management, something ungoverned and briefly uncontrolled. It was not love. She was not sure it had ever been love, but it was something, possession perhaps, or the particular rage of a man who has always gotten what he decided to get and is encountering, possibly for the first time, an actual wall. Then he straightened his collar, turned, and walked off the porch. She heard his car start, heard it reverse on the gravel and find the road. Heard it go. Ryder turned from the door and looked at her once, not checking in, not seeking emotional confirmation, just looking the way you look at a bridge you're not sure will hold before you cross it. "Okay?" he said. "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "What?" Breed found her on the covered porch an hour later, sitting on an upturned milk crate with Ryder's jacket still over her shoulders, watching the field to the west where the snow had smoothed everything to a single uninterrupted white. He lowered himself into a wooden chair with the careful deliberation of a man managing several old injuries and produced a thermos from somewhere inside his vest and poured 2 metal cups without asking. He said, and handed her one. She took it. "Is that a greeting or a comment?" "Mostly a habit." He looked out at the field. "Daniel Hale, tort lawyer. 12 years at Kessler and Brann, made partner in 9. 2 prior marriages, no children from either. Drives a gray Lexus, $300 haircuts, gym membership he uses twice a week because he cares more about having it than using it." He sipped his coffee. "His firm has a PI on retainer." Savannah turned to look at him. "How do you—" "Ghost pulled it in 40 minutes this morning while you were sleeping. We like to know who's standing on our porch before they stand on it, when we can manage it." He shrugged. "Couldn't manage it last night. Managed it this morning." She sat with this. Outside, 2 of the younger riders were in the lot working on a bike. She could see them through the porch railing, one prone beneath it, one crouched with a wrench. Their conversation in low fragments she couldn't make out. "Should I be worried?" she asked. Breed considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "About Hale? He's a man who's accustomed to winning things in rooms, courts, negotiations, conversations. He came here this morning to win something and he didn't, and men like that don't process that cleanly." He looked at her sidelong. "He's going to come back at this differently." "How?" "Don't know yet. Ghost is working on it." He wrapped his hands around the metal cup. "But I'd say you should be ready for this to get procedural. He's a lawyer. He'll use what lawyers use." She thought of Daniel at the restaurant table, the deliberate selection of the setting, the timing, the wine, the careful curation of the moment in which he delivered what amounted to an eviction notice. He'd been choosing the high ground since before she'd sat down. She'd simply not understood the terrain. "He could say things about this place," she said. "About the club." "He could. He will. Probably." Breed didn't sound concerned. He sounded like a man who had been the subject of things people said and had reached an equanimity about it built from long exposure. He wouldn't be the first. She looked at the patches on his vest, the hawk in gold, and below it smaller patches she was beginning to read as a language she didn't yet speak. A flag, a set of years, a phrase too small for her to make out. All of it earned, she was beginning to understand. All of it meaning something specific to the people who wore it, even if the outside world read it as threat. "What does Iron Covenant mean?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Brotherhood made of obligation," he said. "Not to a flag, not to a doctrine. To each other. To people who can't protect themselves." He turned the cup in his hands. "There are 12 of us full patch. Another 8 prospects and associates. Between us, we've got 4 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, 3 tours in places you don't want to know about in the dark, 2 guys who spent time inside for things that were more complicated than their records say, and 1 man who drove an ambulance in Fallujah for 14 months and still can't hear a car backfire without his hands going wrong." He looked out at the field. "We are not easy men, but we are not what people assume when they see the leather." The younger girl, Emma's little sister, whose name Savannah had learned this morning was Lily, appeared at the porch door in her coat and snow boots, holding a drawing she had apparently completed at some speed and with enormous intention. She looked at Savannah without the social navigation an older child would apply and simply held the drawing out. It was a house, crayon, On the back of a paper bag from the kitchen, a wide house with what appeared to be motorcycles in front of it, and inside the window several figures of varying sizes. One of the figures had long hair. "That's you," Lily said, pointing at the long-haired figure, stating it as established fact. Savannah took the drawing. "Thank you, Lily." Lily studied her for a moment with those wide, dark eyes, making some internal assessment, and then nodded once as if confirming something, and went back inside. Breed looked at the drawing without comment, but something around his eyes changed slightly. A deepening of those long, use-worn creases that could be from smiling. "How long has Ryder been raising them?" Savannah asked. A pause. Long enough that she understood the question had weight she hadn't fully registered when she asked it. "Emma came first," Breed said finally. 7 years ago. Her mother was a friend of the club. Good woman, hard life, made a bad choice with the wrong man, and he left her with a daughter and a court case she couldn't win. She died before the case resolved. Emma was 2. He looked out at the lot. Marcus, 4 years ago. His situation was different, harder in some ways. He doesn't talk about what he remembers from before, and we don't push. A pause. Lily was 18 months ago. She was 3 when she came. She hasn't had nightmares in 6 months, which Ryder treats like a personal victory, which it is. Savannah looked at the drawing, the wide house, the figures in the window. "What about Ryder's?" She stopped. "His wife," Breed said. He didn't make her ask it fully. "Claire, 6 years ago. Aneurysm. No warning, no decline, no chance to prepare. She was 34. They'd been married 8 years. He let the silence hold the weight of that. He took Emma 2 months after. Some people thought it was too soon. Ryder thought it was the only thing that made sense. Grief is a thing you can either sit in or build something inside of. Another pause. He builds. She looked at the door through which Lily had disappeared. Thought of Marcus with his rock collection and his complete absence of social anxiety. Thought of Emma with her sharp eyes and her repaired stuffed animal and her assessment of strangers delivered with the frankness of a child who had learned that frank assessment was safer than false comfort. Thought of Ryder dropping to one knee when Lily crossed the room. "He's not what I expected," she said. "Nobody is," Breed said, "if you spend enough time with them." He straightened from the chair with the careful management of his old injuries. "You need anything, you ask. There's no transaction in it. That's not how this works." He picked up his thermos. "But I'd get inside before the cold gets back under you. You've been through enough for one morning." The days started passing in a way she hadn't expected. Not slowly, as she'd feared time would pass in a place she didn't belong, but with the particular velocity of days that are full of specific and functional things. There was a rhythm in the clubhouse she'd been unaware of from the outside. Early mornings with the smell of Torch's coffee and the sound of the wood stove being stoked. The 3 children through the kitchen at different stages of preparedness for school. Ryder navigating the complex logistics of getting 3 people of different ages and different opinions about morning out the door in a coherent sequence. She started helping without announcing she was going to. The first day, she made Lily's lunch when the conversation between Ryder and Emma over a lost permission slip had consumed the window in which the lunch would otherwise have been made. Nobody said anything about it. Ryder glanced at the counter when he came back into the kitchen and found the lunch bag there, and something passed across his face that was not quite surprise because he had, she thought, already registered her as the kind of person who did things without announcement, and he was simply confirming the data. The second day, she reorganized the paper system on the counter. Permission slips, medical forms, club correspondence, Marcus's school projects, all of it layered into a geological record of life administered under pressure. She found a system and built it without asking permission, using the cardboard from a case of oil in the garage and markers from the kitchen drawer. When Ghost came in and found it, he stood in front of it for a long moment with his arms crossed. "Ryder know you did this?" he asked. "Not yet." He looked at it longer. "Better, actually." He poured coffee and left. The third day, she met Nomad. She had not met Nomad yet because Nomad had been at the far end of the property in a structure she'd been told was the machine shop and had apparently been there continuously since her arrival, emerging for meals with the focused, blinkered quality of a man in the middle of something that required all available attention. He was lean and somewhere in his mid-50s, with gray hair worn long and tied back, and a face that had been constructed in a series of planes, very angular, the kind of face that looked carved rather than grown. He wore his vest but no jacket indoors, even in February, and his arms from the elbows down were covered in ink so old it had gone blue-green at the edges. Not decorative in the commercial sense, but narrative. Every piece carrying the particular weight of something that meant something specific once and still did. He sat across the kitchen table from Savannah at lunch on the third day and looked at her with eyes the color of strong tea, and he said nothing for the first 4 minutes of the meal, which was not rudeness but the natural habit of a man who had decided long ago that words were expensive and should not be spent without purpose. Then he said, "You're going to be trouble." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you belong here," he said, "and you're not sure yet if you're allowed to. That combination makes people unpredictable." He ate. "I've seen it before. Usually takes about 2 weeks before it becomes a problem or an asset." "Which way does it go usually?" He looked at her over his coffee. "Depends on the person." He returned to his meal. "What do you do?" "Outside of this. I have a degree in education. I was substitute teaching." She paused. "I haven't worked full-time in 2 years, Daniel." She stopped. "My husband, ex-husband. He preferred that I was available." Nomad chewed, said nothing. "I know how that sounds," she said. "It sounds like someone managed you," he said flatly. "Doesn't say anything about who you are, only about what you allowed for long enough that it became the situation." He stood, rinsed his plate in the sink with the efficiency of a man who has cleaned up after himself in many kitchens under many conditions, and looked at her once more. "2 weeks," he said. "You'll know by then?" He went back to the machine shop. She sat with her coffee and the organized counter and the drawing Lily had made that she'd folded carefully and put in the pocket of the jacket she was still technically borrowing, and she thought about what it meant to be managed, and whether there was a self underneath the management that was still intact, or whether the management had gone deep enough that the self had accommodated itself around it like a tree growing around a fence post until the fence post was structural. She was still thinking about it when the front door opened and Ghost came in at a pace she hadn't seen from him before. Fast, decisive, none of the casual economy of movement she'd associated with him. He went directly to the main room and she heard him on the phone before he'd sat down. "Yeah," he said. "How many?" A pause. "Who signed it?" She stood in the kitchen doorway. Ghost was at the table with his phone, not the mechanical project this time, his body carrying attention that was new to the space. The eye that tracked correctly was focused and flat. Ryder came in from the back door at the same time, still in his work clothes, carrying something that turned out to be engine grease on his hands, which he was wiping methodically with a rag. He read Ghost's posture the way you read a barometer, and the rag stopped moving. "What?" he said. Not the question. Ghost ended the call, looked up. "Complaint filed this morning with the County Social Services Office. Anonymous tip about unsafe living conditions at this address, specifically regarding the welfare of 3 minors in the custody of a non-biological guardian." The room went very still. "It's procedural," Ghost said. "Desk flag for now. But they're required to follow up on every complaint. Inspector has to visit within 72 hours. If they find anything..." "They won't find anything," Ryder said. His voice was level. Entirely, carefully level. "They don't have to find anything real," Ghost said. "They have to find enough to generate paperwork. And paperwork generates more paperwork. And that generates attention. And I know how it works." Ryder set the rag down on the counter. His hands were not entirely steady, Savannah noticed, and she thought it was not from anger, but from something much older and much more personal than anger. Something that knew exactly what was at stake and had known for years that it was stakeable. She stepped fully into the room. Both men looked at her. "It was Daniel," she said. Ghost looked at her without expression, not denying it. "He came here this morning and didn't get what he wanted," she said. "He went back to his firm and he used what he had. He doesn't know anything about this club. He saw children and a non-biological guardian, and he found the lever." She heard her own voice as if from a short distance, very precise, very steady. "This is my fault." "It's not," Ryder said immediately. "It is. The causal sequence is direct. I'm here. He came here. He didn't..." Savannah. His voice cut across hers, not unkind, but with an authority that was not performative. It simply landed, and the landing said, "Stop. Look at me. It's not your fault that someone chose to do this. It's his fault. Don't do that math." She looked at him. The gray eyes were steady. Whatever was moving underneath the stillness, and something with real force behind it. It was contained, managed, directed inward. He had, she understood, years of practice keeping the things that most threatened to undo him from showing anywhere useful. "What do we do?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. This woman he'd known for 3 days, standing in the middle of his household, asking what we do. And something passed across his face that was too fast to read completely. Then it was gone. "We clean an already clean house," he said. "Ghost gets everything documented. Breed calls the family lawyer. We have a retainer for exactly this kind of thing because it's not the first time someone's tried this angle." He picked the rag back up. Not because his hands needed wiping, but because he needed something to do with them. "And we wait." "I could leave," she said. "If my being here is what's—" "You're not leaving," he said. The same tone as the coffee this morning and the doctor in the room last night. The same tone that stated rather than argued. "Ryder, you leave because of him. That's a win for him." He folded the rag with a precision that was its own form of control. "We don't give him wins." Ghost was looking at his phone again. Then he looked up at Ryder with the quality that told Savannah this was the part he'd been building toward. "There's more," Ghost said. Ryder waited. He filed a separate complaint. Non-anonymous this time. His name, his firm letterhead. Filed it with the DMV licensing board and the county zoning office. Ghost set the phone on the table. The complaint alleges that Iron Covenant is operating an unlicensed commercial repair facility on residentially zoned land, and that club activities constitute a public nuisance with demonstrated history of criminal association. "We have a commercial license," Ryder said. "We've had it for—" "He's not trying to win the complaint," Ghost said. "He's trying to generate the investigation. DMV flag triggers an audit. Audit triggers a review of every vehicle maintenance record we have. That takes months, even clean, and during those months we can't—" "I know what it triggers," Ryder said. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the lot was still, the bikes under their snow covers, the sky the brutal winter blue. Somewhere in the building, Marcus was home from school early with a head cold that Torch had been managing with the no-nonsense competence of a former combat medic treating a patient who wanted to negotiate his way out of bed rest. Savannah thought about what Breed had said on the porch. He's going to come back at this differently. He'll use what lawyers use. She thought about Daniel at the restaurant table with the wine between them untouched and the decision already made before she'd sat down. She thought about the 12 years she had spent in the same room as a man who was always on the next step before she'd fully absorbed the current one. "He's going to keep going," she said. "He won't stop at 2 complaints. Ghost and Ryder both looked at her. "He has a template now," she said. "He came here this morning and you wouldn't give him what he wanted, so he filed 2 complaints by afternoon. That's not impulsive, that was planned. He had those complaints drafted before he came here. He drove here knowing you'd say no, because saying no gave him the standing to file as a concerned party." She heard herself say it and recognized, with the particular clarity of proximity, the exact shape of Daniel Hale's operational logic. He needs to be seen as the reasonable one, the concerned ex-husband. He comes here, gets turned away, files complaints for the record. Everything he does from here will be designed to make this place look dangerous and to make me look like a victim who doesn't know she's a victim. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences she'd been sitting in since she arrived. This one had edges. Ghost looked at Ryder. "She's right." "I know she's right," Ryder said. "So what do we do about it?" Ryder was quiet for a moment. His hands were very still. "We do what we always do," he said. "We don't give him anything to find." He looked at Savannah. "And we don't hide." The social services inspector arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 days into the 72-hour window, at 9:15. She was a woman in her mid-40s named Cora Reyes, small and precise with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a clipboard that she carried the way people carry tools they've been using professionally for a long time. She did not appear intimidated by the clubhouse or by the four men visible in the main room when Ryder opened the door, which told Savannah something about what Cora Reyes had seen in the course of her career. Ryder had prepared. Not in a way that was obvious. He hadn't staged the house or arranged things differently than they were, because differently than they were would have been obvious, and Ryder Knox did not play that game. But he'd asked Savannah the previous evening what a social services inspector actually looked for, and she'd told him. And he'd listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interruption, with the same focused attendance he brought to all information that mattered. And then he'd simply made sure that the things that mattered were visible without performance. The children's rooms were clean because they were clean. The kitchen had food in it because it always did. There were books on the shelves and homework on the table and medical records in the file drawer that Ghost had organized with the same meticulous efficiency he brought to intelligence work. Cora Reyes walked through the house with her clipboard and her glasses and her professional neutrality, asking questions in a tone that was neither hostile nor warm, but simply businesslike. And Ryder answered them in the same register. No extra words, no over-explanation, the honest, direct responses of a man with nothing to hide, who also has no interest in performing innocence he already possesses. Emma was at school. Marcus was at school, recovered from his cold. Lily was not at school because Lily did not go to school yet, and she was in the main room with a pile of blocks and the stuffed animal when Cora Reyes came through. Lily looked up at the inspector and assessed her with those wide, dark eyes, and then returned to her blocks, which appeared to satisfy some professional criterion of Cora Reyes because Savannah saw her make a note. "Who are you?" Cora Reyes asked Savannah, not unkindly. "Savannah Hale. She paused at the gap where her role in this household didn't yet have a clean noun. "A friend. I've been staying here for the past few days." The inspector looked at her for a moment with the slight extra attention of someone who has heard the real question inside an incomplete answer and chose not to press it. She was there for 2 hours. She looked at the garage and the machine shop and the main room and the kitchen and the children's bedrooms. And she spoke briefly with Torch in the kitchen about the medical supplies he maintained, and with Breed on the porch about the club's charity operations. And at the end of it, she stood on the porch with her clipboard and looked out at the lot and the bikes and the winter fields. And then she looked at Ryder standing beside the door with his arms loose and his gray eyes giving nothing and taking everything. "The complaint alleged specific safety hazards," she said. "I didn't observe any. The complaint alleged unstable living conditions. I didn't observe any." She made a note. "I'll file my report by end of week. Based on what I've seen, there's no grounds for further investigation." Ryder said, "Thank you." She looked at him once more. That extra assessment look, the one that was doing something more than professional due diligence. "Mr. Knox," she said, "I've done this job for 22 years. I can usually tell, by the end of a visit, what kind of household I'm looking at." She paused. "You've built something good here." She left. The gravel crunched under her car and found the road, and she was gone. Ryder stood on the porch for a long moment after her taillights disappeared. Savannah was behind him in the doorway. She watched the tension in his back, the particular quality of a man coming down from a sustained alert, the long, slow exhale of held breath. He turned and she stepped aside to let him back in, and as he passed her in the doorway, he said very quietly, "Thank you for knowing what she'd look for." It was 3 words that weren't thank you. What they were was, "You were useful here. You were useful in a way that mattered. You did something in this household that required knowing things and applying them correctly. And I noticed." Coming from Ryder Knox, who spent words the way a man on a desert crossing spends water, it landed with the specific weight of high-value currency. She said, "Of course," and meant it. The evening of the inspector's visit, Nomad was in the kitchen when Savannah came through, and he was doing something she hadn't seen him do yet. Just sitting. No project, no phone, just sitting at the table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, looking at the surface of the table. And when she came in, he looked up with those tea-colored eyes and the expression of a man who has been somewhere in his own head and is returning from it. "Week 2, he said. She poured coffee and sat across from him. "What?" "I said 2 weeks. He turned the cup in his hands. "It's been 10 days. You made the right call this morning, figuring Hale's play before Ghost did. That's an asset." He looked at her. But you're still leaving a door open. She waited. You came here without anywhere to go, he said. And we took you in, which is what we do. And you're useful and you're good with the kids and Ryder trusts you, which doesn't happen in 10 days, or it hasn't happened in 6 years, which is the same data point. He set the cup down. But you're still here the way a person is somewhere temporary. You haven't unpacked. She thought about the grocery bag of clothes still in the small room, the jacket she kept returning to the hook each night and taking back each morning as if borrowing it was a debt that would someday be called in. I didn't bring anything to unpack, she said. That's not what I mean. She looked at him. You're protecting yourself, he said. Which makes sense. You got thrown into a storm by someone you trusted and picked up by strangers, and you're waiting for the next thing to go wrong because that's what happened last time and the time before. He was quiet for a moment. But here's the thing about this place. The thing that people who end up here don't usually understand until it's too late to be surprised by it. He looked at her directly. We don't pick people up to put them down. When Ryder turns around on the highway, he commits. That's the only gear he has. She thought about what Breed had said. He builds. I know, she said. No, Nomad said. You know it intellectually. You don't believe it yet. He stood, taking his cold coffee to the sink. You will. She sat in the kitchen after he left. The wood stove in the main room was audible through the wall, the low tick and settle of it doing its work. Outside, it had gotten dark early the way February nights did, and the lot was lit by the porch light and the faint ambient glow of the neon sign over the garage entrance. Iron Covenant Motorworks, red and gold, buzzing faintly in the cold. She sat and listened to the house. Emma reading something in her room, the occasional page-turned silence. Marcus asleep already. He went down fast and hard in the manner of a 6-year-old who treats unconsciousness as a project to be completed efficiently. Lily, she knew, would be in the main room until Ryder carried her to bed, which he did every night without announcement, as simply as closing a window against the cold. She thought about Daniel, thought about Cora Reyes filing her report, thought about what Ghost had said about paperwork generating paperwork, and what she knew from 10 days of watching how these men operated, about the ways a sustained campaign of procedural harassment could erode a structure, even one that was entirely clean, if it was applied long enough and with enough precision. She thought about what she could do, not in the abstract, but specifically, what she actually possessed in the way of knowledge and capability that could be applied to this problem. She had a background in education and family systems, and she had 12 years of learning, up close, how Daniel Hale operated, and she had, it turned out, an ability to read his logic that nobody else in this building had, because nobody else had spent 5 years living inside it. She was still thinking when the front door opened and Ryder came in from wherever he'd been, the machine shop or one of the late administrative tasks she'd noticed him handling after the children were settled, and found her in the kitchen in the dark, the coffee untouched. He turned on the light without ceremony, looked at her. What? I know what he's going to do next, she said. He sat down across from her, the heavy chair taking his weight. He didn't ask how or why or what makes you think. He just looked at her with the gray eyes and waited, which was how Ryder Knox always received important information, completely, without interruption, with the full and undivided weight of his attention. He's going to go after the children directly, she said. Not through social services. He saw that wasn't going to work. He's going to find the biological family connections and use them. Emma's mother had a case that didn't resolve. Marcus's situation before he came here was complicated and hard in ways you said he doesn't talk about. Lily was 3 when she arrived. She leaned forward slightly. Daniel's firm does family law. It's 40% of their revenue. If he pulls the files on any one of those 3 children and finds an open thread, a surviving relative, an unresolved case, anything, he will pull it. He will do it not because he wants the children, he doesn't care about the children, but because disrupting the children disrupts you. And disrupting you is how he gets back at me for not leaving when he told me to. The kitchen was very quiet. Ryder was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the medic's assessment, not the long-practiced management of something felt and contained. Something more direct. Something that had come up through the layers and was simply there on the surface, unmediated. How sure are you? He said. I lived with him for 12 years, she said. I'm certain. He stood. He went to the window over the sink and looked out at the dark lot and the bikes and the neon and the winter night beyond it. His hands were flat on the counter. "Marcus," he said quietly. Not to her, to the window, to the darkness. She waited. "Marcus's biological father is in a federal correctional facility in Ohio," he said, "scheduled for early release review in 3 months." He didn't turn from the window. "He has a public defender on retainer who has been looking periodically for standing to reopen the custody question." A pause. The counter absorbed the pressure of his hands. "I have a family lawyer. I have documentation. I have everything in order." Another pause. "But in order and bulletproof are different things, and if someone with resources and motivation decides to spend those resources on finding the gap..." He stopped. She understood what he was not finishing. That everything he had built, Emma and Marcus and Lily and the photographs on the walls, and the bones of this household constructed from grief and intention and 6 years of stubborn daily work, had a crack in it. Not one he'd made. Not one he could fully close. Just the natural vulnerability of anything built by love in a world that didn't always recognize love as sufficient grounds. She'd done this. Her presence here had brought the specific attention of the one person with both the motive and the professional architecture to find that crack and put weight on it. She sat with that knowledge and let it be what it was. "I'll go," she said. And she meant it this time, not as a self-protective move, not as an offer she expected to be refused, as the honest calculation of someone who has identified the variable causing damage to a system she cared about and was prepared to remove the variable. Ryder turned from the window, and in his face, she saw something she had not been prepared for. Not the refusal she'd expected, not the flat, decisive, "we don't give him" wins. Something raw, something that had climbed up from below the management and was looking at her with an expression that said, "I know what you're offering, and I know why, and it's the wrong answer. But more than that, something she couldn't finish reading because he closed it down, pulled the long-practiced management back over it, and looked at her with the gray eyes that gave nothing. "You're not leaving," he said. "Ryder, Emma asked me this morning if you were going to teach her how to do the thing with the paper." His voice was entirely controlled. Entirely. "The organization system. She wouldn't ask that if she didn't think you'd be here long enough to teach her." Savannah was quiet. "Lily finished a drawing of you last night," he said. "At the table. You and her and Marcus. She put it on the refrigerator." A pause. "She's never put a drawing of a person she's known less than 2 weeks on the refrigerator." She looked at the refrigerator. There it was. Why, crayon on paper, 3 figures at a table, all of them with enormous hands. The middle figure with long hair and what was apparently a coffee cup. "Ryder, we handle it," he said. Flat, final, the decision-informing tone. "Together. All of it." He looked at her once, the something from below the management still there in the gray eyes, briefly and entirely visible, before he put it away again. That's not going to change. She wanted to say something, several things. She wanted to say that she was terrified of being the reason something bad happened to Marcus's custody case, or Emma's stability, or any of the specific fragile, beautiful things she'd spent 10 days inside. She wanted to say she had no practice being inside something real enough to be worth protecting. She wanted to say the word Nomad had used, that she knew it intellectually, she didn't believe it yet, and ask him how long it took for the belief to catch up. What she said was, "Okay." He nodded, turned back to the window. Outside, a pair of headlights appeared at the end of the gravel drive. One of the riders returning from somewhere, the engine sound reaching them a moment after the lights. The neon buzzed. The wood stove ticked in the next room. It should have been enough. The inspector's report would clear them. Ghost was documenting. Breed had the lawyer on retainer. Ryder was not a man who left cracks unguarded. It should have been enough. But in the morning, Ghost came in with his phone held out to Ryder with an expression she'd never seen on him. And Ghost had been in 2 wars and several situations he didn't talk about, and his expressions were not given easily. Ryder took the phone and read what was on it, and the stillness that came over him was not the managed stillness of a man containing his response. It was the stillness of a man who has been hit somewhere he cannot afford to be hit, and has not yet found the recovery. He handed the phone to Savannah without a word. She read it. Daniel Hale's firm had filed a motion in Colfax County Family Court. On behalf of a petitioner she did not recognize, a name she had never heard, requesting an emergency review of the custody arrangements for Marcus Dale, age 6, currently in the informal guardianship of Ryder Knox. The grounds cited were new evidence regarding the petitioner's capacity for rehabilitation and the alleged instability of the current living arrangement, citing specifically the recent presence of a non-vetted adult female and the documented history of law enforcement contact associated with the Iron Covenant Motorcycle Club. The hearing date was in 11 days. Savannah looked up from the phone. Ryder was standing with his back to the counter with his arms crossed, looking at something that wasn't in the room, his jaw set in the particular way it set when he was containing something with real force behind it. Ghost was by the door, still and watchful, and from upstairs she could hear Marcus getting up. The particular 6-year-old thunder of him, the voice already at full volume at 6:50 in the morning, asking whether there were pancakes. 11 days. She set the phone on the counter, looked at Ryder, looked at the drawing on the refrigerator, the 3 figures at the table, the long-haired woman with the coffee cup, the enormous hands, the crayon colors of a child who had put her there with complete conviction because of course she was there. She belonged there. Where else would she be? She said, "Tell me everything you know about Marcus's case. Every document, every date, every name." Her voice was very steady. "And I'll tell you everything I know about how Daniel builds a strategy." She pulled out the stool and sat down. "We have 11 days. Let's start now." They worked through the night, not together at first. Savannah at the kitchen table with the documents Ryder pulled from the file drawer, Ghost across from her with his laptop, and the particular focused intensity of a man who treats information as both weapon and currency. Ryder standing at the counter reading through papers with the deliberate pace of someone who has read them before and is reading them again because something new is in the room and he needs to know if it changes what the words mean. Marcus's case file was 43 pages. Savannah read every one. The legal history was what Ryder had described. Biological father incarcerated on federal trafficking charges. Mother deceased 18 months before Ryder took custody. Informal arrangement formalized through county family court 2 years ago, with the particular fragility of all arrangements built on the assumption that no one with standing would appear to challenge them. The family lawyer had done competent work. The documentation was solid. The child's welfare had been consistently, demonstrably prioritized. But on page 31, there was a name. Raymond Voss, listed as maternal uncle, biological family contact, status at time of filing, address unknown, no response to court notification attempts. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Ghost. "This name," she said, "Raymond Voss. Do you have anything on him?" Ghost took the page, read it. His expression did not change, but something shifted in the quality of his stillness. "Why?" "Because Daniel's firm filed on behalf of a petitioner," she said. "The motion didn't name the petitioner. That's unusual. Emergency review motions typically name the petitioner." She kept her voice level. "Which means they're protecting the petitioner's identity from advance disclosure. Which means the petitioner is someone who has reason to believe that advance disclosure would allow time for a counter strategy." She looked at Ryder. "He found someone. Someone with standing who doesn't want to be found until the courtroom." Ryder looked at her, then at the page, then at Ghost. Ghost was already typing. The answer came back at 2 in the morning, and it came back wrong. Ghost set his laptop on the table and turned it so Ryder could see the screen and said nothing, which was its own category of communication, the silence of a man delivering information he cannot improve by adding words to it. Ryder read. The muscle in his jaw moved once. He straightened and looked at the ceiling for 3 seconds and then looked back at the screen. "Say it," Savannah said. Ghost looked at her. Raymond Voss isn't unknown. He's been known to federal law enforcement for 7 years under 2 different aliases. He runs a fencing operation out of 3 states, stolen vehicles, parts, occasionally other things. He's been investigated 4 times and indicted once, conviction overturned on procedural grounds. He paused. He's also been a paid informant for the DEA at least twice, which is why the conviction didn't stick and why his address stays officially unknown. The kitchen was very quiet. "He's Marcus's uncle," Savannah said. "By blood," Ghost said. "Not by anything else." "Daniel found him," she said. Not a question. "Daniel's firm has federal contacts. Family law practice at that level, you build relationships with people who can find people. Ghost closed the laptop. Voss has no real interest in Marcus. He has zero documented contact with the child, zero history of involvement. But he has standing, blood standing, and someone has apparently made it worth his time to show up and use it. She looked at Ryder. He was very still at the counter, the stillness that was not management now, but something underneath management, something that had gotten past the layers and was simply present in the room with them. Daniel paid him, she said. Can't prove that, Ghost said. Yet. He paid him, or he offered him something, she said. Legal cover, maybe. The overturned conviction. There may be outstanding exposure that a firm with federal connections could make go away. She heard herself say it and felt, distantly, the particular nausea of recognizing the full shape of something you've been looking at only partially. He didn't just file a complaint. He built an asset. He found someone with standing, and he weaponized him. She looked at her hands on the table. That took weeks. He started this before he came to the porch, before I was even here long enough for him to know I was staying. The implication of that landed in the room and stayed there. He was watching, Ghost said, quietly, confirming. He had someone watching, she said, from the day I didn't come home. Ryder turned from the counter and walked out of the kitchen. Not fast, not with visible anger, just walked out through the main room, and she heard the front door open and close with a specific quietness that was worse than slamming. Ghost looked at her, said nothing. She stood up and followed. He was on the porch in the cold without a jacket, standing at the railing, looking at the lot where the bikes stood under their covers in the dark. His breath came in slow, even clouds. The temperature had dropped below 20 and the sky was clear and brutally starred, the kind of winter sky that offers beauty as compensation for the cold it delivers. She stood beside him without speaking. The cold hit her immediately. She was in a thermal shirt and jeans, no jacket, and the February night was not interested in her comfort. She put her hands in her pockets and looked at the lot. After a while, he said, I knew there was a crack. I know. I've known since the beginning. Marcus's case was never fully closed. I told myself it was close enough. A pause. His hands were on the railing, the cold not appearing to register on them. Claire used to say that close enough was how things fell apart. She was right about most things. She was quiet. The name Claire, said aloud in that particular register, not grief exactly, something past grief, something that had been processed and integrated but was still present the way a healed injury is still present, permanently part of the structure, landed with its own weight. I should have moved faster on the legal finalization, he said. I had reasons for not pushing. The lawyer said the informal arrangement was stable, that pushing for full legal closure might actually draw attention to the gaps rather than close them. I listened because I wanted to listen. His voice was entirely level. That was mine. That decision was mine. You couldn't have known Daniel would. No, he said, but I knew the crack existed, and I chose comfortable over certain. He looked out at the dark. Marcus trusts me. He trusts this house. He's never had a consistent address for more than 8 months in his entire life, and he's been here 2 years and he sleeps like the dead and he argues about bedtime because he doesn't want to stop being awake inside this place. A very long pause. If that gets taken from him... He stopped. The porch railing bore the weight of his hands. She wanted to say something adequate. She did not have anything adequate. What she had was the truth, which was that she had brought this here, that Daniel had known where she was because she existed and he was a man who tracked things, and that everything currently threatening Marcus's stability had a line back to her sitting in that bus shelter instead of somewhere else. She said, I'm going to fix it. He looked at her then. The gray eyes in the cold starlight held something she still didn't have a full vocabulary for, but less guarded than it had been 11 days ago, less carefully contained, something that looked in this light like the early structure of trust, not complete, not unearned, just beginning to be built. We're going to fix it, he said, correcting the pronoun the same way she'd corrected it 11 days ago. She nodded. The cold was doing serious work on her now. She'd been outside long enough that her fingers were losing their precision, the old memory of the bus shelter waking up in her nerve endings with interest. She turned to go back inside. His hand caught her wrist. Light, immediate, there and then gone. But she stopped. "You're cold," he said. It was not what he was saying. "I'm fine," she said. It was not what she was saying either. They went back inside. The next 7 days moved with the particular quality of time under pressure, simultaneously too fast and granular, every hour containing more decisions than it should, the specific acceleration of a situation that has a hard deadline and does not care whether you're ready. Ghost found the connection between Daniel's firm and Raymond Voss through a chain of financial disclosure records that were technically public and practically buried. 3 LLCs, a consulting payment, a retainer agreement that didn't name the service being retained, but contained dates that mapped precisely onto the weeks following Savannah's arrival at the clubhouse. It wasn't proof in the legal sense. It was architecture, the shape of something real, visible to anyone who knew where to look and was willing to do the work of looking. Breed's family lawyer, a compact woman named Judith Crane, who arrived on day 3 in a car that was too expensive for the building she pulled up to and didn't seem to notice, read the architecture and said, "This is thin." "It's the start," Ghost said. "Starts don't win hearings," she said. "Evidence wins hearings." She looked at Ryder. "What I can do is slow this down. Challenge the emergency designation. There's no genuine emergency here. The child is safe and has been safe for 2 years, and emergency review motions require demonstrated immediate risk, not potential future questions." She set her briefcase on the table. "That buys us time. What I need from you is everything. Every document, every communication, every person who has ever interacted with Marcus's custody situation." "You'll have it," Ryder said. She looked at Savannah. "Who are you?" "Savannah Hale." "Hale." The name registered. Daniel Hale's wife. Ex-wife. Or close enough. Judith Crane looked at her for a moment with the precise, calibrated assessment of a lawyer evaluating a variable. "Are you willing to submit a declaration?" "What kind?" "Character. Time spent in the household. Your observations of the child's welfare and the stability of his care arrangement." A pause. "And your knowledge of Daniel Hale's operational methods, specifically regarding the construction of this legal strategy." Savannah thought about what that meant. Her name on a document. Her account of 12 years on the record. Daniel reading it. "Yes." "Is he yes?" she said. Judith Crane nodded once, accepting this with the same brisk efficiency with which she'd accepted everything else. "I'll need it in 72 hours. She left with a box of files and the particular energy of a woman who is most alive when she has an unreasonable amount to do in an insufficient amount of time. On day 5, the second thing happened. Ghost came in from outside at 4 in the afternoon with his jaw set in a way that read as controlled but not comfortable, and he went directly to Ryder in the garage, and they spoke for 3 minutes in voices too low for Savannah to hear from the kitchen where she was working on her declaration at the table, Marcus beside her doing homework with the companionable focus of a child who has decided that where you are is where things happen. Ryder came into the kitchen. He looked at Marcus. "Hey, bud," he said, normal voice. The ordinary register of a man addressing a 6-year-old about an ordinary thing. "Torch made cookies. They're in the tin by the stove." Marcus processed the non sequitur, recognized it as a dismissal delivered in the language of a treat, and departed with the pragmatic efficiency of a child who knows that the cookie is real even if the timing is suspicious. Ryder closed the kitchen door. Ghost was behind him. "What?" Savannah said. Ghost put his phone on the table. It showed a photograph. Taken from a distance, telephoto, the kind of image produced by someone who did not want to be seen taking it. The subject was the front of the clubhouse, the gravel drive, the bikes visible in the lot, and at the edge of the frame, barely there, the corner of a dark sedan parked on the county road 50 yards from the drive entrance. "How long?" Ryder said. "I picked it up this morning," Ghost said. But looking back at the trail camera footage from the last week, he took the phone back, scrolled, handed it back. That same car, different positions on the road, but always with a line of sight to the property. Savannah looked at the photograph. "Daniel's PI, or Voss," Ghost said. "Or both. Voss may have his own people, depending on what he actually does for a living versus what his record says he does." He took the phone. But here's the part that matters. He scrolled again. This photograph was different, clearer, closer, taken by the trail camera at the property's east corner at what the timestamp read as 11:47 p.m. 4 nights ago. The sedan again. But this time a man was outside the car, standing at the edge of the property line in the dark, looking at the building, not photographing it, not surveilling it in the professional manner of a PI with a brief. Just standing and looking with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a person thinking about something or deciding something. He's not just gathering information, Ghost said. He's been out there at night, 3 times in the last week. The kitchen was very quiet. Savannah became aware of Marcus's voice from the main room. The cookie apparently located, the assessment of it being communicated to Lily with considerable enthusiasm. "This isn't just a legal strategy anymore," she said. Ghost looked at Ryder. "No," Ryder said. His voice was flat, the flattest she'd heard it. "Voss has a record that includes things beyond fencing," Ghost said. "One of the investigations, the one that didn't result in an indictment, involved intimidation. A witness who changed their testimony after a 2-day period in which they were not reachable." He let that sit. The case involved a property dispute. Someone wanted something that belonged to someone else and found a way to make the someone else decide they no longer wanted it. Savannah set down her pen. "He's done this before," she said. "Pressure someone until they abandon what they have. The legal motion is the official mechanism, but the man in the dark at the property line is the real message." She looked at Ryder. Daniel told him about the children. He told him that the children are the leverage, and Voss is... She stopped. "Deciding," Ghost said, "whether to take a different approach." The word approach hung in the kitchen air like smoke. Ryder stood up from the table. He moved to the window and stood with his back to them for a moment, looking out at the lit lot, the bikes, the dark county road beyond the drive. His hands went to the counter, the same position as 3 nights ago. And she recognized in the posture not the controlled grief of a man managing old pain, but something current and close and sharp. "He's not going to touch them," Ryder said. Not to Ghost, not to Savannah, to the window, to the dark road. A statement of intent delivered to the situation itself. Ghost said, "We need to be careful how we—" "I know." The counter took his hands. "I know." She said, "Ryder." He turned. "We need to call Judith Crane tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight. What Ghost found about the surveillance, the nighttime visits, the pattern, that changes the nature of the threat from legal to potentially physical, and that changes the legal options available to us." She kept her voice steady. "Documented surveillance of a family home, including minors, by an individual with a history of witness intimidation. That's a different filing than what we had yesterday." Something shifted in Ryder's expression. The recognition of a strategy being identified. The specific alert of a man who thinks tactically and has just been handed a real option. "Judith can use that." "She can do more than use it," Savannah said. "She can flip it. Right now, Voss and Daniel are constructing a narrative where this house is the instability and they're the concerned parties seeking safety for the child. If we file first on the surveillance, if we get to a judge before their hearing date with documentation of a man with a criminal record for intimidation conducting nighttime surveillance of a home containing children, we don't just defend, we change the terrain." Ghost was already looking at his phone, composing something. Ryder looked at her for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this for days." "Since I read the case file." She met his gaze. "Daniel taught me how he thinks. That's the only useful thing that came out of 12 years. Something passed across his face. The something from below the management, visible again for just a second, and this time she held its gaze long enough to understand a part of what it was, not just the early structure of trust. Something further along the road than that, something that had been building in the specific way that things build between people who have been in crisis together, who have sat at the same table in the middle of the night and worked toward the same thing with everything they had. He looked away first, pulled out his own phone. "I'll call Judith," he said. The call lasted 40 minutes. Judith Crane, reached at 8 p.m. with the information about Voss and the surveillance documentation, went quiet for 11 seconds in a way that told Savannah she was reorganizing everything she'd previously planned, and then she said, Give me the trail camera footage. All of it. I need it by 6 a.m. She got it by midnight. At 2:30 in the morning, with Marcus and Emma and Lily asleep, and the main room down to Ryder and Savannah and the wood stove and the low sound of wind picking up outside, Breed came in from the cold with snow on his jacket and the expression of a man who has been somewhere and learned something and has not decided how to deliver it. He sat. He poured coffee. He looked at Ryder. I went to see a man, Breed said, someone who knew Voss from before, served time adjacent to him, not the same facility, but they moved in the same circles afterward. He wrapped his hands around the cup. I needed to know whether Voss was the kind of man who follows through or the kind who uses the threat. The room was quiet. Both, Breed said, depending on the payment. He looked at Savannah. The person who funded him, your ex, made a specific offer, not just the legal cover Ghost found. There was a secondary offer, cash, structured as a consulting fee for testimony. He paused. And a third component. Ryder waited. Hale's firm has a relationship with a federal attorney who has been looking at Iron Covenant for 4 years, Breed said. Nothing specific. General interest. The way federal attention sometimes settles on a club that operates near state lines without ever finding anything because there's nothing to find. His voice was very even. The offer to Voss included an introduction, an implicit promise that if Voss delivered the custody case, if he forced Ryder to surrender Marcus to a court-appointed arrangement, the federal attorney's attention would be redirected. Call off the ambient surveillance in exchange for the win. The wood stove ticked. The wind pushed against the windows. Savannah looked at Breed. Daniel has a contact in a federal attorney's office. Had access to, Breed said carefully. Whether the federal attorney is actually in the arrangement or whether Hale simply made a promise he could deliver on is unclear. He looked at Ryder. But Voss believes it, which is what matters for how Voss is going to act. She thought about Daniel at his desk at Kessler and Brand, the corner office she'd been inside twice, the view of the city, the walls of case files and the framed certificates, and the particular order of a man who had spent 2 decades building leverage. She thought about the $200 bottle of wine that sat untouched between them while he told her she was broken. She thought about him driving home from the clubhouse that morning and picking up his phone before he'd cleared the county road, already planning, already 3 moves ahead. She had known Daniel was precise. She had not known the depth of the architecture. She had not known he would go this far. He's not trying to get me back, she said. The words came out quiet. Everyone in the room looked at her. He never was, she said. When he came to the porch, it wasn't to reconcile. It was to see who had me, to assess what he was working against. She heard herself say it and felt the thing it was doing to her chest. Not grief, something colder and more specific than grief. The particular feeling of understanding, finally and completely, that something you thought was one kind of thing was always a different kind. He filed the complaints and built the Voss strategy before he came here. He already knew he wasn't going to get me back. What he wanted was to make sure that wherever I went, it cost me, and that anyone who took me in paid a price for it. The room was quiet. Ghost said very quietly, "Punitive." "Yes," she said. Ryder was looking at her with an expression that had nothing managed in it. It was simply open, in the way that a man's face goes open when he's looking at something that has changed the shape of what he understands. "This isn't your fault," he said. "I know," she said. And this time she meant it differently than she'd meant it before. Not the acceptance of a verdict, but the accurate assessment of a situation. She had not caused Daniel to be what he was. She had not caused him to build leverage the way other men built furniture, habitually, casually, for use when needed. She had simply been in his life long enough to be incorporated into the architecture, and when she'd left the architecture, he'd found a use for her exit. "But it is my problem to solve," she said, "because I'm the one who knows him well enough to solve it." Breed looked at her over his coffee, Nomad's voice in her memory. 2 weeks. Asset or problem? She could see Breed making the same calculation and arriving at the same answer, and the particular quality of that recognition, being seen clearly by people who did not need to pretend, settled in her chest with a weight that was not uncomfortable. "What are you thinking?" Ryder said. She looked at him. Outside the windows, the wind had picked up fully now, carrying the first scattering of something that wasn't quite rain and wasn't quite sleet, clicking against the glass in irregular patterns. The neon sign over the garage buzzed and flickered. Somewhere on the county road, in a dark sedan, a man with a criminal history for intimidation was possibly still sitting and looking at the light in the windows of this building and deciding things. Daniel made one mistake, she said, one structural mistake in the whole strategy. Ryder waited. He used a man who has federal exposure, she said. Raymond Voss has been a DEA informant twice. That means the DEA has files on him. Active files. Informants don't stop having active files just because a case closes. The relationship exists. She leaned forward, and the relationship has value to the DEA that exceeds whatever Daniel promised Voss, because what Daniel promised Voss is the cessation of federal attention on a motorcycle club that has never done anything illegal. That's a promise Daniel made but cannot actually deliver, because the decision to redirect federal attention isn't his to make. She looked around the table. Voss is carrying federal exposure, and he accepted a promise that has no actual backing. If someone made that clear to the right person at the DEA, not accusingly, not as a legal action, but simply as an information disclosure, the kind of thing that occurs between people who have been in adjacent spaces to federal investigations and know how those things work, Ghost was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was, she thought, something in the vicinity of respect. Voss becomes a liability to Daniel instead of an asset, Ghost said. And without Voss, Daniel has no petitioner, she said. No standing. The motion fails on its own terms. She looked at Ryder. But there's a window. If Daniel realizes Voss is compromised before we can move, he pulls the motion and rebuilds with something else. We have to move first. Ryder was looking at her with the gray eyes completely clear and fully present. You know people in federal spaces? She asked Breed. Breed looked at Ryder. Ryder looked at him. Something passed between them that was the compressed language of men who have known each other for many years and can communicate the essential contents of a complex conversation in a glance. We know people, Breed said. Then we have maybe 48 hours before Daniel's PI reports back on the surveillance documentation and Daniel realizes we have it and starts revising, she said. After that, the terrain changes and I don't know what he builds next. She looked around the table. Breed's experienced stillness, Ghost-focused precision, Ryder's gray-eyed, complete attention. So we go tonight. Whatever contact you have, we go tonight. The wind threw sleet against the windows. And then Ghost's phone rang. He looked at the screen and something in his face shifted. The smallest possible change. The kind that only registered if you had been watching him long enough to know his baseline. He stood up from the table and stepped toward the far end of the room before answering, and he said 3 words into the phone that Savannah couldn't make out, and then he listened for 90 seconds without speaking, and then he ended the call. He turned around, and she understood from the quality of what was in his face, Ghost, who had been in 2 wars and several situations he didn't talk about, and whose face was not given easily, that what had just happened on that call was not part of the strategy they'd been building. It was something else. Something outside the architecture of Daniel and Voss and the courthouse and everything she'd spent 11 days learning to navigate. Something worse. He looked at Ryder. Torch just called from outside, Ghost said. There's a car on fire at the end of the drive. Nobody moved for 1 full second. And the Voss vehicle is gone, Ghost said. Trail cam shows it left 12 minutes ago, heading toward Millhaven. A pause that had the quality of a man choosing words with extreme care. There were 2 people in it when it left. Savannah looked at the window, at the flickering neon, at the dark road beyond the lot where orange light was beginning to color the edge of the sky in the direction of the drive entrance. 2 people, Ryder said. Voss, Ghost said, and someone who came in a separate vehicle that we didn't catch on the trail cam, which means they came through the east field on foot. He looked at the table, at the documents, at Savannah's declaration, half finished in her handwriting. The east field runs along the back of the property. His voice was very careful. The back of the property, where the children's bedrooms face. The word face landed in the room like a concussion. Ryder was already moving, and Savannah was on her feet before she'd decided to stand, because whatever she had been in this house for the last 11 days, guest, temporary arrangement, borrowed presence waiting to believe she was allowed to be here, She understood in this moment with absolute, irreversible clarity that it did not matter what noun she used for what she was. What mattered was that Marcus and Emma and Lily were in rooms that faced the East Field, and the East Field had just been accessed by a man with a record for intimidation who had come in on foot in the dark, and she was already in the hallway when Ryder caught her arm. Not to stop her, to go first. He moved past her with the controlled velocity of a man shifting from stillness to full action, with nothing between. No transition, no ramp, the switch thrown and the machine already running at capacity. She followed him down the hallway toward the children's wing, her socks soundless on the wooden floor, her heart doing something against her sternum that was not quite fear and not quite anything else she had a name for. Ryder hit Emma's door first, opened it. Emma was in her bed, asleep, the stuffed animal against her chest, her breathing the deep, even rhythm of someone who had been completely unconscious for hours. The window facing the East Field was closed and latched, nothing disturbed. Marcus's room. Asleep. Rock collection on the shelf undisturbed. Window closed. Lily's room. Ryder went through the door and crossed to the bed in 2 steps and put one hand against Lily's back and held it there, and the child stirred faintly and made a sound and settled back into sleep, and he stood over her for 3 full seconds with his hand on her back and his eyes on the window and his jaw carrying the weight of something that had no safe outlet and nowhere to go. Then he turned. And what was in his face when he turned was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him. Not the something from below the management, not the briefly visible layer beneath the gray-eyed control. This was the whole of it, unfiltered, the face of a man who has just walked toward the thing he cannot afford to lose and found it intact, and who is now operating entirely outside the range of management. He closed Lily's door. In the hallway he stopped and pressed his back to the wall and looked at the ceiling for 3 seconds. Breathing, returning. Then he looked at Savannah. Stay with them. Ryder, stay with them. Not a request. Not even the usual informing tone. Something rawer than either. Please. She stayed. Outside it was controlled chaos in the specific manner of men who have operated in actual chaos and know the difference. She heard it from the hallway. Boots on the porch. Breed's voice giving short direction. The particular sound of multiple engines turning over in the cold, the crunch of tires on gravel moving fast. Ghost's voice once, sharp, and then the radio silence of men who've said what needs saying and are doing the thing. She sat on the floor in the hallway between Marcus's door and Lily's door, with her back against the wall and her knees up, and listened to the night sounds of the house settling against the wind, and to her own breathing, which she was managing manually again the way she had in the bus shelter. Except this time, it wasn't cold taking her apart. It was the particular sensation of being inside something that mattered too much to hold lightly. She thought about Daniel in his corner office. She thought about Voss in the dark sedan. She thought about the car burning at the end of the drive. Not accidental, not random, a message with punctuation, delivered by a man who had stood at the edge of this property in the dark on 3 separate nights, deciding whether to make it a different kind of message. She thought about what it meant that he'd decided tonight. 30 minutes passed. 40. The house was quiet in the way of a house where children are sleeping through something large and adult happening around them, which was its own kind of mercy. Then boots on the porch. The front door. She stood. Ryder came down the hallway alone, and he was not untouched. His jacket was gone. His thermal shirt had a tear at the left shoulder, and there was a cut above his right eyebrow that had bled and stopped and would need attention. He was walking without favoring anything, which told her whatever had happened to him he considered acceptable. She stopped herself from reaching for his face. Stopped herself deliberately, the stopping requiring more conscious effort than it should have. "Voss," she said, "County Sheriff has him." His voice was flat and tired in a new way. Not the bone tired of a long day, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has done something he would have preferred not to do and has no regret about doing it. He came back. Torch spotted him at the east fence line. He had a pause, choosing words. He had a bag. We don't know yet what was in it. Sheriff has it. She absorbed this. He was going to do something to the property. Yes, not the children directly. We don't know what he was going to do directly. The flatness of his voice carried the weight of that not knowing, which was its own kind of violence. He's in custody. Ghost is on the phone with Judith Crane right now. What he had in the bag plus the surveillance documentation plus his record. He stopped. It's enough. It should be enough. And Daniel, she said. Ryder looked at her. Outside, the remaining engines idled down, one by one. The neon buzzed. The sleet had stopped and left the world outside glassy and precise. Ghost's contact came through, he said. The DEA conversation happened tonight while everything else was happening. Something crossed his face. Voss made a phone call from the back of the sheriff's car. One call. His lawyer. He looked at her. Except the number wasn't his lawyer's number. Ghost pulled it. It was a cell registered to an LLC associated with Kessler and Brand. She was quiet for a moment. He called Daniel from custody with a sheriff's deputy in the front seat. The implication of that, the panic in it, Voss using his one call not for legal protection, but to report failure to the man who'd funded him, settled over her with a cold clarity. Daniel knows it fell apart, she said. Yes. He's going to run from it, distance himself from Voss, disclaim the relationship, let Voss take the criminal exposure alone. She knew this with the certainty of someone who has watched a particular mind operate for 12 years. He'll be on the phone with his partners right now constructing the cover. Ryder said, Let him. She looked at him. Let him run from it, he said. Ghost has the financial trail. Judith has the surveillance documentation and whatever was in that bag. The federal angle on Voss is live, and it names the contacts Daniel used to make the promise. His voice had found a new register. Not the flat management, not the exhausted rawness. Something between the two, something that was simply certain. He built this entire thing on the assumption that we'd have no moves, that we'd be too busy defending to see what he was actually constructing. He looked at her. You saw it. She shook her head. We saw it. He looked at her for a long moment in the dim hallway with the children's doors on either side of them and the sound of the club outside settling after the night's work and the neon buzzing its faithful low note through the window glass. Then, from behind Marcus's door, a small, sleepy voice. Is someone out there? Ryder turned to the door immediately, the shift from whatever the hallway had been to the specific, unhesitating register of a man who orients to that voice the way a compass orients north. He opened the door. Marcus was sitting up in bed with his hair going in its usual 17 directions, squinting in the hallway light with the focused confusion of a 6-year-old who has woken mid-cycle. Hey, Ryder said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Yeah, I'm here. Thought I heard something. Wind, Ryder said. Go back. Marcus squinted at him, registered the cut above the eyebrow with the clinical interest of a child who notices everything. You have a owie. I'm aware. Did you fall? Sort of. Marcus considered this with great seriousness. You should put a bandage on it. I will. Savannah knows where the bandages are, Marcus said, and lay back down with the absolute efficiency of a child returning to sleep, as if this had been a minor administrative matter successfully resolved. Ryder sat on the edge of the bed for another moment, watching him. His hands were in his lap. His back was to Savannah in the doorway, and she could not see his face, but she did not need to. She went to the bathroom and found the first aid kit. She did know where the bandages were. Marcus was correct. She'd reorganized the cabinet on day 4, and she came back to the hallway and waited. When Ryder came out and pulled the door gently shut behind him, he looked at the kit in her hands and then at her, and sat down on the hallway bench without comment. She cleaned the cut above his eyebrow with antiseptic, and he didn't move or make a sound, just looked at the wall behind her with the gray eyes steady. And she put 2 butterfly closures on it with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. And she was very aware of the distance, or lack of it, and the quality of the silence between them, which had become something different from all the previous silences, something that had a specific gravity to it, something that pulled. Judith needs to file by 8 a.m., he said, quietly. Practical. Returning to the immediate. She will. The motion gets challenged. Voss in custody changes the petitioner's standing entirely. It does. Marcus's case will be fine, she said. Ryder, it will be fine. He looked at her then, not at the wall, at her, the full gray attention with nothing between it and her, and what was in it was everything she'd been reading in pieces over the past 11 days, finally assembled and present and not going back below any layer. He said, "When this is done," and then Ghost was in the hallway, phone held out, face carrying urgency. "Judith," Ghost said, "she needs you both." "Now." Ryder stood. He looked at Savannah once. The "when this is done" still in the air between them, unfinished, a sentence with no period yet. He took the phone. Outside, a single Harley turned over in the cold, breed or nomad or one of the others, maintaining a perimeter through the rest of the night because that was what they did. That was what they had always done. And the sound of it moved through the walls of the building like a pulse, like something alive and certain and not going anywhere. Savannah stood in this hallway between the children's rooms with the first aid kit in her hands and listened to Ryder's voice in the next room, already clear and focused and moving through the specifics of what Judith needed, already building the next thing from the current crisis the way he built everything. Without performance, without hesitation, with the stubborn daily competence of a man who has decided that what he loves will not be taken from him. Not tonight, not by anyone. And for the first time since the bus shelter and the green dress and Daniel's flat hands on the white tablecloth, she understood, not intellectually, not as a conclusion reached through logic, but in the body, in the specific place where beliefs actually live, that she was not in temporary shelter anymore. She was home. And there was still one thing left undone. Daniel Hale had not yet heard her voice say that. Judith Crane filed at 7:41 a.m. The motion was 48 pages, and it was in Judith's own words delivered over the phone with the particular satisfaction of a lawyer who has been handed exactly the right materials at exactly the right moment. Comprehensive. It contained the trail camera documentation, the financial disclosure records Ghost had assembled, the DEA contact confirmation, the sheriff's report on Voss's arrest and the contents of the bag, accelerant, which answered the question of what he'd intended for the property, and a declaration from Savannah Hale, 30 years old, former resident of the household of Daniel Hale of Kessler and Brand, attesting in precise and specific language to the construction of the legal strategy, the operational methods of the man who'd built it, and the 12 years of proximity that made her testimony credible. The emergency review motion was withdrawn by 9:15, not fought. Withdrawn. The distinction mattered. Fighting it would have generated a record, a hearing, a public proceeding in which the financial trail and the Voss connection and the accelerant in the bag would have been entered into evidence. Withdrawal was quieter. It was Daniel calculating one final time the terrain of what remained and choosing the option that preserved the most. Judith called Ryder at 9:20 to tell him. He was in the kitchen. He listened to her say it, said thank you, ended the call, and set the phone on the counter. He stood there for a moment with his hands flat on the counter and his eyes on the middle distance and his jaw doing the thing it did when something with real force behind it needed to be contained. Then Marcus came through in his school clothes, backpack on, demanding to know if there were eggs, and Ryder turned from the counter and said yes, and made them. Savannah watched this from the doorway and felt something in her chest that she did not try to name because naming it would have required looking directly at it, and she was not ready yet for the full light of that. She made coffee instead. She made it the way Torch had taught her, with the seriousness it deserved, and she set a mug beside Ryder's elbow without announcing she was doing it, and he reached for it without looking and drank. Well, Daniel called at 11. She was in the main room when her phone rang. The old number, his name still in her contacts because she hadn't changed it, and now understood she'd left it there as a form of vigilance, the way you leave a door unlocked when you're waiting for something to finally come through it. She answered, "Savannah." His voice was contained, entirely contained, which meant he was working. "I want you to know that what happened last night was not—" "I know what it was," she said. A pause. "Voss acted outside. Daniel." She kept her voice very level, colder than she'd expected it to be. The cold of someone who has been through enough that the temperature of a conversation is something she chooses now rather than something that happens to her. Raymond Voss came onto this property with accelerant. There are children here, children who have already lost more than you can account for. She heard her own voice and recognized in it something that had not been there before. Not anger, not accusation, certainty. The DEA has the financial structure. Judith Crane has the rest. You know what the exposure looks like. Silence. "You're going to leave this alone," she said, Not because I'm asking you to, because you've done the math, and leaving it alone is the only move that preserves what you still have. A pause. That's the language you understand, so that's what I'm saying. She could hear him breathing, the deliberate breath of a man maintaining control of a conversation he has lost. I told you once that you were broken, he said finally. Quiet. The last card he had. You did, she said. You were wrong. She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Outside the window, the lot was ordinary in the morning light. Bikes uncovered now. Nomad crouched beside one of them with a coffee in one hand and a socket wrench in the other, the particular piece of a man returned to his primary relationship with machinery. The sky was the pale thin blue of a winter morning after a storm. The fields to the west were still white, but the snow was receding at the edges, the dark earth beginning to show through in patches. She set the phone face down on the table. Done. Ryder found her on the porch that afternoon. He came out with 2 mugs the way Breed had come out weeks ago, which she understood was a form of language in this household. The coffee as a statement of intent, the mug as an opening. He sat in the wooden chair. She was on the milk crate. The cold was present but manageable, the particular cold of late winter that has less conviction than it did in February. He handed her the mug. They looked at the field for a while. Marcus's case, he said. Judith is filing for full legal finalization. With Voss in custody and the motion withdrawn, there's no opposing standing. She says it should be clean. He turned the mug. 6 to 8 weeks. Good, she said. Emma wants to know if you'll help her with the paper organization system. He said it without preface, without the particular careful neutrality of a man introducing a subject he is uncertain about. Just stated it. She's been doing it wrong. She hasn't been doing it wrong, Savannah said. She's been doing it her way. Those aren't the same thing? Definitely not. She looked at him sideways. The cut above his eyebrow had closed cleanly, the butterfly strip still in place, the bruising around it now the yellow-green of healing rather than the deep purple of impact. I'll show her. Both systems. She can choose. He nodded. The silence that came after was of the variety she had learned to read as a specific category. Not the absence of words, but the presence of something that was deciding whether it needed them. She waited it out the way she'd learned to wait out Ryder Knox's silences, which was by not trying to fill them. When Claire died, he said, and she was still. The thing I understood was that grief was going to be the condition of everything for a long time. Not an event, not a stage with an end, just the weather. He looked at the field. I took Emma 2 months later because Breed said it was too soon, and I knew Breed was right and I did it anyway, because the grief was going to be the weather regardless, and I could either sit in an empty house with it, or I could give it somewhere to go. She was quiet. It didn't fix it, he said. It didn't replace anything. Emma was not a substitute, and she knew it, and I knew it, and we were both just 2 people with losses trying to be useful to each other in the same space. He looked at his coffee. But it was the right thing. Not because it healed anything, because it was the right thing. She thought about Nomad's voice. The thing about this place that people don't usually understand until it's too late to be surprised by it. When Ryder turns around on the highway, he commits. I didn't come here looking for anything, she said. I was just cold. I was just sitting in the cold and not thinking past the next minute. I know, he said. I don't know how to do this, she said. The this left to context. He understood the context. Neither do I, he said. I haven't done it in 6 years. A pause. But I know what it looks like when something is right, even when I don't know how it works yet. He looked at her directly. The gray eyes without management, without the layers, just present and clear and completely certain of what they were looking at. You reorganized my counter on day 2. You figured Daniel's play before Ghost did. You sat in the hallway between those doors all night, and you didn't leave. His voice was even. I know what that is. She held his gaze. The porch held them. The field held its receding snow. The neon over the garage hummed its low, faithful note. Okay, she said. Not a concession, not a surrender. A door opened by someone who has finally, fully decided that what's on the other side is worth walking through. His mouth moved, Not quite a smile, something more interior than a smile, something that had been a long time arriving and knew it. He looked back at the field. They finished their coffee. Amma? Spring came the way springs come after hard winters. Not gently, but with the aggressive insistence of something that has been waiting and is done waiting. March brought mud and the sound of water moving under ice and the particular smell of the earth deciding to be alive again. And by April, the planters on the porch railing had been refilled by Emma, who had opinions about what went where that she communicated with the frankness she applied to all things. And Savannah had learned to present both options and let her choose. She enrolled in the Family Services Graduate Program at the county college in March. The application had taken her one evening, and she'd sat at the kitchen table with Marcus beside her doing his own homework with his own particular brand of focused chaos. And when she'd submitted it, she'd felt something she didn't have a word for yet. Not relief. Something more forward-facing than relief. The sense of a direction that was hers. Lily started calling her by name instead of the careful pronoun avoidance she'd used in the beginning, which Torch noted without comment, but with the expression of a man registering a significant data point. Marcus added a new section to his rock collection and labeled it in Savannah's handwriting because his handwriting was, in his own assessment, not ready for labels yet. Ghost, who had found the financial trail and the federal connection and the surveillance pattern and had done it all with the focused precision of a man for whom information was a craft, said exactly one thing to Savannah about any of it in the weeks that followed. He said it on a Tuesday morning in April over coffee, without looking up from the carburetor he'd returned to. "You did good," he said. She understood this was the fullest available expression of what he meant, and she accepted it as such. Ryder did not make speeches. He did not, in the manner of men who had learned language in a different context, find words for the interior architecture of what had changed. What he did was come home to a kitchen that smelled like coffee and something Savannah had learned from Torch, and set his jacket on the hook beside hers, which had been beside his for 6 weeks now, and not remark on the fact because the fact did not require remark. It simply was. The way things that have found their right place simply are. On a Saturday in late April, the whole club rode. Not for a purpose, not for a charity run or a meeting or anything logistical, just rode, the way they sometimes did when the weather turned and the road opened up and the collective need to move became larger than the need to stay still. 13 bikes out of the lot in formation, the sound of them building as they hit the open county road and opened up. And Emma in the sidecar with Diesel because she had asked with the directness she brought to all requests, and Diesel had said yes with the directness he brought to all responses. Marcus watched them go from the porch with the expression of a 6-year-old making a decision. He looked at Savannah. "When I'm bigger," he said, "I'm going to ride." "I know," she said. "Will you still be here?" She looked at him. This child with his 17-direction hair and his rock collection and his complete unconscious certainty about the world when the world was this porch and these people. And she felt the full weight of the question, which was not really a question about logistics. "Yes," she said. He nodded, accepted this. Returned to his juice. The sound of the bikes faded east toward the open road, toward the fields and the county line, and whatever was past it, and the morning settled into the ordinary sounds of the household and the smell of coffee from inside, and the pale April sun doing its patient work on the last of the winter's damage. Savannah stood on the porch of a building she had not heard of 8 weeks ago and listened to the silence the bikes left behind. And she thought about the bus shelter, and the dress, and the dead phone, and the cold that had been trying to finish something Daniel had started. She thought about what she'd believed in that cold, about being broken, about being outside the category of people that others stop for, about the particular loneliness of a woman who has spent so long being managed that she'd mistaken the management for herself. She thought about an engine sound coming up through a bench before it came through the air, about a jacket placed over her shoulders without ceremony, about 3 children who had asked her name and absorbed her answer and moved immediately to the next question, which was whether she was staying, and had not once seemed to doubt that the answer was yes, because it was apparently obvious to everyone except her. She was not broken. She had been cold. She had been waiting, in the cold, for the right people. They had turned around. That was all. That was everything. A convoy of imperfect, scarred, difficult, loyal men who had built something real from what remained after the official structures failed, who had turned around on a winter highway because one of them had seen a woman in a green dress who needed a jacket, and who had not once asked her to be anything other than what she was while she found out what that was. She went inside. The coffee was still hot. The kitchen was warm. From the back room, she could hear Lily's voice explaining something to her stuffed animal with great authority, and the ordinary morning sounds of the house settled around her like a thing that fitted, like a thing that was hers, like a thing that had always been waiting for her to stop standing outside it and come in. She came in.